Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Emergency Home Learning Summit. We're with Gary Stager. Gary, what a pleasure to be talking to you.
Welcome to the pandemic Barbie dream house. I apologize for the Unabomber look, but as I was just mentioning to you, I haven't had a haircut since February of this year. I was going to shave the beard and mustache, but I thought I would leave it for one more video setting and then get rid of it.
Nice. I feel honored. So, Gary, what was your school story growing up? Were you a good
Uh,
student? Were you a
oh,
rebellious student?
no, I wasn't a good student. Um, well, my one of my earliest memories of school was in second grade, making the teacher cry because I organized a boycott of her Arbor Day poems. And I also remember being tied to my chair with a jump rope by the same teacher. Um, and school was sort of, and in fourth grade, the child study team's official recommendation to my parents was get him out of here. They didn't have a plan for where the other alternative was, but just not here. Um, but I went through suburban New Jersey, upper middle class, um, college prep sort of educational experience. Never spoke with my parents about college. They weren't involved in my decisions or where I applied or what I wanted to study. And despite the fact that I wasn't a particularly good student, there was never a question that I was going to be going to higher education, which is kind of interesting. And there were a couple of other sort of seminal experiences during my education, despite the fact that a lot of it was pretty awful. By about middle school, I had some remarkable teachers who introduced me to computer programming and jazz improvisation and music composition. And those are the things that continue to bring the most joy and beauty and purpose and meaning to my life. And one of the animating principles of all of my work for the last almost 39 years is I'll be damned if a future generation of kids are deprived of those rich learning experiences. So there was always a place that I could hang out. There were always teachers who I viewed collegially, even as a little kid. Um, and and that was kind of my experience. And despite my PhD in science mathematics education, I was particularly terrible at school science and math. Um, one one other one other anecdote that you might find interesting that I rarely talk about is something I've wondered about since the early 70s. And that was at the exact same time that the school system was recommending to my parents that I go anywhere but there. Um, the exact same school district was involved in a very sophisticated open education pilot. No, not open education in the sort of nonsense today of free software, but in the sort of deeply rich progressive tradition of John Holt and Illich and Herb Cole and Charles Silberman and um, Lillian Weber of learner centered education and freedom and choice and also influenced by Summerhill. And I'm told was the project was actually studied by the Rand Corporation, and I would kill for any of the data, but I have no idea of how to get any of it. Um, but the reason why I've been thinking about this for a very long time is that I wasn't part of that project. I wasn't part of that project because they decided that half of the elementary schools would go open and the other half wouldn't. And I just happened to live on the wrong street. And it boggles my mind all these decades later that no, it hadn't occurred to any adult in power or authority to say, hey, maybe some kids would be happier or more productive in that environment rather than this environment. And the reason why you can so easily declare that open education was a failure is because the teachers who were teaching in those schools weren't doing so because they were intellectually prepared or predisposed towards democratic schooling, but because that's where their parking spaces were. They literally just said, this school, that school, every other school got to be open classroom. And that kind of blows my mind all these decades later. So I think I might have profited from it. And I know it would have been a lot more successful if teachers who wanted to teach that way were able to do so. The other anecdote from my own education experience is that in seventh grade, based on standardized test scores, I assume, I tested into something called unified math. It was kind of a post-Sputnik curriculum that said, instead of discrete mathematical topics like algebra, geometry, trig, whatever, stuff would be mixed up and mashed together, and it would go fast. And you would be in this track of kids in this sort of integrated math approach from seventh grade until you graduated high school. And I was invited to be in it. And, you know, like anyone else who was told you were smart and clever and whatever, I and my parents thought this was a great idea. By the end of eighth grade, I kind of hated myself and hated math and hated my math teacher and felt stupid. And by ninth grade, I was in the near bottom level of algebra in the high school. And then I kind of limped through school math, you know, through the subsequent high school years. And in 12th grade, I took a course called, what was it called? Math for Liberal Arts. And the idea of math for liberal arts was, you're not really good at math, but you're going to go to university and you probably need another math requirement. And I remember the teacher coming in the first day and saying, this guy named Ed O'Connor said, let me see if I can help you understand the stuff my colleagues are supposed to have taught you. And my ears perked up. I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. And then I looked around the room, Steve, and I realized that 80 or 90% of the kids who were in the Math for Dummies class in 12th grade had started in unified math with me in seventh grade. And again, this is one of these great mysteries. To this day, I wonder why none of the adults noticed that the fastest track to the bottom of the math pile was starting at the top of the math pile. That's just my own anecdotal evidence, but I would suspect that it was probably consistent because it was really stark. When I looked around the room, I knew everyone since junior high. I knew everyone since junior high because they were in my class in junior high, and yet by the time the school curriculum had played out, they were deemed defective in that very subject that they'd been identified as gifted in.
So I hear in that story sort of a very direct message of the lack of good understanding or decision making or even sort of thinking deeply about education. But I also hear in that story the fact that we go through these phases in the education cycle of learning and authors and good thinking that almost kind of disappear. Like you go back to open classrooms and open education, you go back and look, and you were associated with Seymour Papert, and you've done a really good job of kind of keeping his legacy alive. But I would guess most people have no idea who he is. It feels like we're so shallow in this arena.
Well, you know, when school leaders tell me, you know, I really want to do the right thing, if only I knew what to do. And I said, like swing by my house. This is about 1/10 of the books that I own. Each one of them will tell you what to do. We stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, I made a slide recently. I could share it if you want, but I made a slide recently where it just, you know, I just listed all of my teachers who have published, who I could fit on one screen. And it, you know, it's sort of voluminous. When I hang out with my friends who were disciples or students or colleagues of Seymour Papert, they often say exactly what you did. They kind of bemoan that so few people are aware of Seymour Papert's life and contributions, despite being arguably one of the most important educational thinkers of the last century. My indictment's a lot more severe than that. It's not they don't know Seymour Papert, they don't know anybody. And we could talk about how and why I think that that's happened. But I look at friends of mine who I have a great deal of respect for, who teach education leadership at the university level, at the graduate school level. And the most charitable description of educational leadership programs that I can muster is that they're really focused on education appreciation. There is no discipline there. You study some lawsuits. You remember that Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954. Maybe it's a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. But when I've taught those courses, including up to the doctoral level, and I mention Cole or Kozel or Lillian Weber or Lawrence Malaguzzi or Deborah Meyer or Ted Sizer or Seymour Papert or Herb Cole or Alfie Kohn, or I could go on and on. Um, you just see people's eyes glaze over. It's right over their heads. Just not part of the mission. I'll tell you one more sort of tragic memory of my own and insight into my own educational experience. We had a principal and two vice principals in my high school of about 2,400 kids, 2,000 to 2,400 kids. And one of the vice principals passed away a few years ago, and people were mourning his departure on Facebook. And there were discussions about what a great educator he was. And it occurred to me that I can't imagine a single scenario in which I could have spent 30 seconds discussing learning with any of the three administrators of my high school. And so I would like to sort of go back in time and ask them what they think their job was. Because one of the things that's happened in the pandemic, and I wrote about this in an article called Stick to Our Knitting. When the pandemic struck, there were folks writing articles and talking about how refreshing and exciting it was that school principals were reporting to them that their focus was no longer on teaching and learning. It was on feeding kids and providing Wi-Fi and keeping them off the streets. And there was a lot of discussions about Maslow, right? And I thought, well, if we're not about teaching and learning, who is? We ought to be doubling down on teaching and learning. This is our secret sauce. This is what we're employed to do. We're supposed to be experts in teaching and learning, not not all this other stuff, which we're doing because of a crisis and because we care about children and because we take our role in the community seriously. But educators should be about education. And to the folks who want to be entrepreneurs and want to quote books written by 12-year-olds from Silicon Valley, like, hey, cool, you don't want to be in education, that's fine. There's no shame in that. Find another career. You're concerned about startup culture, go work in a startup. But education has some really specific objectives and values associated with it. I was participating in a webinar with the educators of Reggio Emilia, small Italian city that's largely known to have the best schools in the universe. The incredibly complex and sophisticated and deeply thinking, caring educators who focus on every nuance of learning and view their role primarily as a researcher to understand the thinking of each child, to make private thinking public and visible thinking visible, to create educational experiences that are reflective of the community and the needs and the desires and the talents and the expertise and the curiosity of children. And they referred to the dictatorship of COVID-19. And you need to understand that geographically, Reggio was the epicenter of the European COVID attack, right? So they dealt with as much trauma as my friends in New York City. And they said, COVID is a dictatorship. We, of course, have to be concerned with health and safety of our children, of our parents, of our teachers, of our community. But beyond that, we cannot remove from our educational system the things we value. That in this bleak time, we need to be doubling down on beauty and texture and playfulness and fun and critical decision making and live our values. And I came away really deeply moved by not only the principles, but just sort of the incredibly clever things they were doing to keep kids safe without sacrificing everything that they value in their educational system. And I commented on it, as I want to do on social media, and immediately people wanted to know what they say, specifics. They want the slides. And I kind it gave me pause because um, living your values is really difficult when you don't have any. And it's not clear to me that if I said to a lot of school leaders, this is the time where our schools need to be doubling down on the things we value, um, that folks would be would be able to access their values.
Would it be fair to say that in the absence of a strong learning culture, the school just descends into bureaucracy? I feel like we've seen that. Instead of the schools that have really strong beliefs about how learning takes place seem to be figuring it out, but the others just seem to be focused on the day-to-day tasks that are measurable in the bureaucracy.
We talk about bureaucracy. We should recognize. I mean, I'll say something nice about schools. Most schools don't have much bureaucracy. Um, you know, I don't know about you, but I've worked for Microsoft. Um, it's a lot more inefficient than the local elementary school that's got a principal and a nice lady who answers the phone. Um, Having said that, bad ideas are timeless and impervious to geographic boundaries, and good ideas tend to be incredibly fragile and require nurturing. And I have a colleague and friend and mentor named Bernard Newsom in Australia, a wise old man that I'm lucky enough to call my friend. And he has a very British educational upbringing and um, worked with some of the great psycholinguists and pioneers in literacy learning in the 60s. And Bernard taught me that every good innovation in education has a 5-year lifespan, right? Principal goes off to a conference, hears about something, brings about back to his school or her school. The teachers are good soldiers. They'll play along. They'll spend a year or two really trying to learn how to do this thing, whatever the thing is, whatever the intervention is. By the third or fourth year, it's become kind of automatic for them, right? They got the wind in their sails and they're kind of going for it. By the fourth or fifth year, if they don't have a deep intellectual or emotional investment in that idea, in that practice, a principal changes, a new school board member gets elected, there was an article in the newspaper, a parent complains, and poof, that thing goes away. Right? So that's why ideas like open education are temporal and declared, failures. I'll tell you, I think excellence is contagious. I think places like Bard College at the higher ed level, place where during the last recession, the president of the school said, I'm hiring people during this time because there's a lot of talent available. And during COVID, they opened in August. They're still open. And aside from the health and safety issues and largely keeping the campus COVID free, they've changed the curriculum to reflect the crazy, chaotic, uncertain times we're in. And their citizen science requirement now is related to infectious diseases. And the literature they're reading has overlapping discussions and topics with the sort of societal crises we're going through. So it's not just sort of not letting a crisis go to waste, but when you have values and you live your values, and you're secure in what you know and you share that with your constituents and you build consensus around it, then regardless of what fate throws your way, you're able to continue on your course. There's a favorite school of mine, Spenceley Street Primary School. It's my favorite school in the whole world. It's a P to 6, or as they call it, or K to 6 primary school in Melbourne, Australia. It's a public school that 50 years ago committed to open education. If you walk in today, there's 4 areas with about 80 kids in an area. K to 6, kids involved in all sorts of projects, interdisciplinary learning, multi-age learning. They have a really fabulous relationship with teachers. Parents come and go. Kids love being there. Teachers love the kids. Parents are happy to share their kids with the school. And it just ticks over year after year after year. My friend who was the principal and another friend who were the deputy principal both retired last year. I was scared to death that the school would go up in smoke. They managed to hire someone who doesn't seem to be destroying the place, and I stay in touch with her as much as I can. And in the height of the lockdown there a few months ago, she sent me a link. She said, "This will cheer you up." and it was a recording of the podcast that kids in the school were creating while they were in lockdown. And this isn't going to win a Peabody or a Pulitzer. It's just good, solid, charming, sweet, creative, lovely work done by children. The sorts of lovely work that all kids should be engaged in. And I said, "Who's the host? He's fabulous." And it turns out it's a kid who I encountered 4 years ago when he was sitting on the playground huffing mad about something. And I introduced myself to him, and we engaged in some impromptu, insane discussion about theology before he grabbed me by the hand and took me around the playground, introducing me to all his friends as Donald Trump. And in any other school, this would have been a kid who you want to get rid of, that he would have been trouble. And now he was doing this lovely thing. And she said, "Hey, maybe you'd like to be on his podcast." I said, "Absolutely." And I have to tell you, Steve, as fun as it is to see you after all this time and to have this conversation, um, the podcast with Danny was even better. And I I I laughed for 45 minutes, and I had really interesting conversations with him. And he said he had done his homework, and he said, "I hear you like jazz." I said, "Oh, yes, I do." And he said, "Me too." I said, "Really? Who's your favorite jazz musician?" And he said, "Sun Ra." Um, this is like a 10-year-old kid in Australia, and I end up having a conversation with him about Sun Ra and Lonnie Liston Smith. And just being the kind of person that I am, I then proceeded to hook him up with a lifetime subscription to online piano lessons with one of the world's great jazz musicians and teachers, just because it's part of my ministry to do those kinds of things, right? Um, to introduce kids to things they don't yet know they love and create a context where they can become good at something. But there was this. It doesn't surprise me that year after year after year, this school is good. When I take people to visit it, I often say to them, particularly Americans, what you're about to see doesn't exist. It's impossible. Don't believe your lying eyes. Because if you read anything about education, you're told, well, we don't want to be that. Right? This is a community. And I'll just say one more thing about this school that's consistent with what I've been describing. When the federal government in Australia became inspired by the education policies of the United States, they decided to have national standardized testing and ranking schools from A to F. And Spenceley Street Primary School said, "No, thank you." And the government went, "What do you mean, no, thank you?" They said, "Yeah, we're not going to do that." "What do you mean you're not going to do that?" So it'll destroy the quality of educational experience that our community has come to value. And because the school invests in ongoing processes of parent education and explaining authentic assessment and whole language and project-based learning, and the community said, yeah, we're with the teachers. And then the teachers union backed them. And then the principals union backed them. And the federal government went away. They said, "You stop being in the newspaper, we'll stop bothering you." And so the school to this day offers parents the right to have your child participate in the testing, but only if you write a letter to that effect. Otherwise, they don't do it. And I'll tell you, my friends who just retired a year ago would get choked up when I'd ask how many kids were participating. I remember them, sort of, wiping away a tear, saying, "Well, 14% of the kids took the test this year," and they viewed that as a failure.
So if I'm a parent or student in this moment in time, what lessons can I take from what you've just described about your decades of insight into learning and education? What would be the lessons for us as a family or as parents or students?
I think one of the purposes of schooling is to create opportunities for kids to spend as much time as possible in the company of interesting adults. So one of the things that parents could do is find ways for kids to spend time in the company of interesting adults, whether that's real or virtual. One of the great gifts that the pandemic has brought us is you can chat with Wynton Marsalis about the records that were um, contributed the most to his musical upbringing, or watch Chick Corea practice the piano for an hour a day, as he did online for about 30 consecutive days, or learn to cook with Jamie Oliver or Michael Simon with their daily, cooking shows online, or take online music lessons, or um, you know, sometimes teachers come up to me, particularly high school teachers, they fold their arms and go, oh, well, what you're talking about is all well and good for little kids, but what if you teach high school physics? And I've got slides I could share with you, but that answer this question. Well, what if your kid could apprentice with Galileo or Einstein? Well, they can, because Stephen Wolfram, who's at that level intellectually, who's made as significant contributions to math and science as anyone living today, has been hosting regularly scheduled Ask Me Anything sessions on the internet where he'll talk to kids about anything they want to discuss in math and science. And one of the slides I've been using in some keynotes that I've been giving online is he did a live coding session with kids around coronavirus spread, understanding the virus and how it spreads, and using data and his Wolfram language tools and Mathematica, these sort of premier tools for making sense of a world of mathematics and science used on the frontiers of math and science by the most sophisticated scientists and mathematicians, computer scientists. And if you look at the date on the YouTube video, which is an archive of a Twitch stream in which he did this live coding experience with kids about coronavirus, it's dated February 10th of this year. What if hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of high school kids had been doing coronavirus research in early February of this year? Would we have had a vaccine sooner? Maybe not. Would public policy be a little less stupid and public behavior be a little less reckless? Probably, right? So I think spending time in the company of interesting adults is important. Another really important part of my life has been that I was the kind of kid who would find people I wanted to hang out with and go hang out with them. And sometimes friends, colleagues, educators who follow me on social media will say, hey, Gary, you seem to go to a lot of concerts. I probably spend 80 nights a year seeing live music. And I owe that to my junior high school teachers and my high school teachers. And they'll say, how do you do that? I say, oh, well, sit down. Yeah, can you grab a pencil and paper? And they grab a pencil and paper. And I say, I buy tickets and then I go. And the reason why I've been able to work with all of my heroes and to share them with educators. In fact, I would just want to get a plug in. December 2nd, I'm having an Ask Me Anything session online with Howard Gardner. That's open to anyone for free. You can go to ama.constructingmodernknowledge.com to sign up for it. Is that I went to where they were and I said, hey, I'm Gary, I'd love to talk to you about something, or can we work together, or can you do my thing? Or so I gave a TED talk about this called Care Less, where the thesis was there are lots of things in life that you should care deeply about. School might not be one of them. Despite the fact that I think that schools are important because that's where the kids are, and that's why I haven't given up on the institution. And I think kids are talented and capable and competent and teachers are as well. And my work has been about demonstrating that, about amplifying the human potential of kids and teachers alike. But I think one of the gifts that this time has given us is we can see the generosity of experts willing to share their expertise with kids, and kids ought to get in the habit of seeking the expertise that they desire. One of the things that I've always loved about jazz musicians is 99% of them will stop anything they're doing for some kid who wants to be like them, or wants to. And I think that's true for almost anyone who's good at what they do. So, I think, I made a list recently. If I could just rattle through these in 5 seconds, I think there's some purposes of schooling that are worth mentioning. One is that we have an obligation to introduce children to things they don't yet know they love. That doesn't mean that we have to coerce them into doing things that they hate, but it means that we should be introducing kids to things that they might not discover on their own. I think we need to model, nurture, and sustain democracy. And we need to model it through our practices and through our conversations. And that's critical in this time. I think as I mentioned a moment ago, that kids need to spend as much time as possible in the company of interesting adults. And one of the ways for teachers to be more interesting is when the bell rings, go home, have a hobby, play with your grandchildren, bake a souffle, read a book, go to a concert. That will benefit the students that you serve. I think that we need to democratize access to expertise, materials, and experiences that kids wouldn't have access to otherwise. And fundamentally, school should be a place that nurtures the temporary or long-term obsession of children so that they can become great at something. I think the something isn't all that important. It's kind of a variable, right? You just insert your something in that variable. But it ought to be a place where you can learn what it looks like to be great at something, so that you can then chart a course and a path towards achieving that personal goal.
That's terrific, Gary. Thank you.